I'm very excited. When we first started planning the conference, Counselor Craig Colton said, "I've got the perfect guy for you," and he encouraged me to reach out to Dr. Gary Machlis. And before I introduce him, I just want to point out that folks like Craig make this happen. It's not just the John and Chris and Marie show. So I would like to ask for all of the AGS counselors who have made it here by 8:15 to stand up. And I appreciate them, and you should appreciate them too. Let's give them a round of applause. And a few more will seep in here, I swear, before it gets too late. So Gary Machlis. Dr. Gary E. Machlis is University Professor of Environmental Sustainability at Clemson University. But more interestingly, not that that's not interesting, he happens to be the science advisor to the director of the U.S. National Park Service. Many of you are probably aware that this is the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service this year. In Washington, D.C., around the Department of Interior, there have been many, many, many celebrations of that. And I think it is something definitely worth celebrating. He's the first scientist appointed to this position within the National Park Service and advises the director on a range of science policy issues and programs. Dr. Machlis also serves as co-leader of the U.S. Department of Interior's Strategic Sciences Group. I have no idea what that means, but it just sounds cool. It conducts scientific assessments during major environmental crises. So Dr. Machlis has been a leader in collaborative higher education and serves as an advisor to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, also known as AAAS, the National Committee on Opportunities for Women and Minorities in Science, which is a committee of the AAAS. He was instrumental in the development of the Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Units, Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Units Network, which includes 13 U.S. federal agencies and over 200 universities, and served as its national coordinator from 1998 to 2006. For this work, Dr. Machlis was the recipient of a Department of Interior's 2000 Conservation Service Award, one of the highest awards given at the department to private citizens. In 2010, also, Dr. Machlis was elected as a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I could literally go on and on and on, but instead, I'm going to let Dr. Machlis come and speak to you today. Come on up.
Thank you. Thanks.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you. This is my last speech as science advisor after 8 years in the Obama administration. And for reasons that will soon come clear, the views presented here do not represent the official views of the U.S. government. I had planned to present to you a largely technical set of remarks on the future of national parks. I had planned to show some extraordinary maps of biodiversity loss, some very cool models of glacial retreat, even sea level rise projections in New York City showing what happens to Lerner Hall and its neighborhood under a 4°C temperature rise. But the election and its aftermath and its very likely impact upon conservation and national parks has caused me to abandon that technocratic pretense. In 1940, the author, geographer, and New Yorker Waldo Frank wrote a prescient book on the future of Western democracies. The book was titled A Chart for Rough Waters. Frank argued that after the democracies defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, they would have to turn to the long war against communist totalitarianism. And when that was defeated, or at least contained, turn finally to their internal divides, such as racism and sexism, what the liberation theologists have called structural violence. And Frank warned us about it. I believe the conservation movement, including the national parks, now must navigate some very rough waters. That it comes at the centennial of the National Park Service 100 years ago this year will be seen by future historians as significant. But for those in the environmental and conservation community, it ranges from disappointing to confusing to challenging to embittering. I want to respond and perhaps provide an emerging sketch of a chart for the rough waters of conservation and national parks. I want to do 4 things. First, I want to share with you, and I want to explain why I believe parks matter. Second, I want to briefly show how political administrations and political principles have consequences, sharing some of the achievements under the Obama administration and why they matter for the next 4 years. Third, I want to suggest several key and immediate challenges that national park advocates must confront and tactics that they might adopt. Fourth, I want to suggest a special role that geography as a discipline and geographers as a professional class can consider. And then I want to say farewell to this part of my work, and that will be that. Why parks matter? The National Park System has over 400 national parks and is visited annually more than Major League Baseball attendance, National Football League attendance, NASCAR attendance, all the Disneyland attendance combined. Yeah. Some of the parks are small, like the Statue of Liberty. Some are like Wrangell St. Elias in Alaska, the size of Switzerland. Or if you would prefer, a national park the size of West Virginia. These parks are operated by the National Park Service with a workforce slightly smaller than the Philadelphia School District. On a budget, an operational budget, roughly equivalent to the Philadelphia school system. There are many arguments made why these parks matter. They're economic engines supporting tourism and travel industry, creating jobs and income and wealth. They are reservoirs of biodiversity and protection of endangered and endemic plants and animals, both species and genetic diversity. They can be considered as museums, preserving scenes and landscapes of great beauty. What has been called America's crown jewels. And they are playgrounds, places for outdoor recreation, nature, study, and personal reflection. I believe these definitions have value, but they are insufficient. I believe national parks represent an American covenant. Secular, yes, but a covenant nevertheless. They are a covenant among us here now, binding whites and blacks, Christians and Jews, Muslims and atheists, rich and poor, Westerners and Easterners. Who among the East have not considered their requisite trip west to Yellowstone as a kind of traditional American pilgrimage? And national parks are also a covenant between generations, promised from the past to the present and promised by the present to future generations. The Park Service is unique in civic life and American government. It's truly fascinating to work for one of the only agencies in the federal government whose mission is to help people have fun. And because we're responsible for protecting these parks for future generations, we find ourselves unique as being in the perpetuity business on an annual appropriation. The covenant has implications. It creates an enduring responsibility to manage and maintain these places, in the words of our Organic Act that established the service, unimpaired for future generations. And it means they are not crown jewels, they are civic jewels belonging to all Americans. As they are civic assets, they are then necessarily political. I want to share some of the achievements of the Park Service in the 2 terms of the Obama administration. I do so not to tout, but to illustrate that political administrations matter and their visions have consequences. Here are some of the parks and monuments established in the last 8 years. Cesar Chavez National Monument in California, commemorating the great immigrant labor organizer. Stonewall National Monument here in New York City, commemorating the rise of the LGBT community. Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument in Washington, D.C., commemorating the women's rights movement and suffrage in the United States. Fort Monroe National Monument in Norfolk, Virginia. Think of what Fort Monroe means to this country. It was the place where the first slaves were offloaded in the New World and sold on a rock. And it was the place that during the Civil War, the legal argument underpinning the Emancipation Proclamation to free those slaves was drawn up. It's a place that brackets slavery in this country. And they're not all historical. The Katahdin Woods and National Monument, an 87,000-acre gift from Roxanne Quimby. For those of you who don't know Roxanne Quimby, she made her fortune on Burt's Bees. So if you use a Burt's Bees, this is not an ad, but if you use a lip balm, the National Parks thanks you. 87,000 acres of Katahdin Woods and Waters, created over strident opposition of some old-style Maine politicians and timbering enthusiasts romantically hoping for the timber industry to come back. Do these parks matter? Do the political visions expressed in their presentation, in their development, matter? As the incoming government seeks to deport illegal immigrants, roll back gay rights, challenge the idea that Black Lives Matter, deny climate change, consider the rising importance of Chavez National Monument, Stonewall National Monument, Fort Monroe, as geographies of engagement, places where people can engage, because the reality is what has been done is to correct the arc of American history. These things always happen. Chavez was an organizer. The Underground Railroad, which has been made into a national monument, existed, but we didn't tell their story. And so these corrections in the truth-telling about American history will last into the future. And during this current administration, we have had what Director Jarvis calls major conservation wins. We restored the Drake Cestero in Point Reyes, California. We removed the Elwha Dams in Olympic National Park. We built the bridges on the Tamiami Trail that allow the waters of the Everglades, the Sea of Grass, to once again flow. And we withdrew uranium mining around the Grand Canyon. These actions reflect a certain view of conservation, one not likely to be repeated by the incoming administration that begins the 20th of January. The NPS, you may not know this, but the National Park Service manages much of the inauguration. We also operate as the moving company to move the previous president out of the White House and the new president in. We manage much of the inauguration, and then we will turn back after the centennial and after the inauguration, back to our mission, now led by the victors of this election. What key challenges emerge for the rough waters of conservation? I think there's 4 that we should get ready for. One is climate change and its deniers. The suppression will be quick, it will be pernicious, and it will be ineffective because the private sector and increasingly the American public understand the true nature of the threat of climate change and our responsibilities to act. A second will be the large landscape conservation movement will be challenged. The attack by its opponents will probably come from private property and takings arguments, and the recent decision to find innocent the Mauer Ridge occupiers will be an encouragement for the battle against large landscape conservation. The third is the erosion of science. And there is a target on geography. There will be the erosion of science, and it will be our country's coming experiment with Harperism, the Canadian silencing of government science by pinpoint elimination and suppression. And the fourth will be the partisan exploitation of the American Covenant of National Parks to try to turn support for national parks into no longer a bipartisan thing, but a political battle like other budgets. Think of it. If you vote against the preservation of the sacred hallowed ground of Gettysburg, how can that be patriotic? I think those 4 are some of the key challenges that we will face, and we will face them immediately. So the question becomes, what then do we do? I think we need to be very careful in navigating the rough waters ahead. It will not do to exaggerate the dangers or underestimate them. It will not do to vilify those that choose accommodation or those that choose resistance. And we must choose our actions thoughtfully and with clear principles. Here are some potential actions to consider. One is the responsibility exists, and someone should take it up, to monitor and expose the retreat, the retrenchment of our conservation program and the environmental sciences. That every time one of the suppression acts occurs, every time the pinpoint elimination, do you have to get rid of the Endangered Species Act? No, you simply have to eliminate the inventory and monitoring program of the Fish and Wildlife Service so that listing cannot be documented. Every time these pinpoint efforts are done, they are monitored not just for history, but for the broader public to actually understand what is occurring. The second is I believe we need to work to train a new generation of environmental leaders. All the young people in this room, yeah, it will. A couple things you should be prepared for. The burden will be on you. My generation is almost done. The burden will be on you. And you face certain things. Your entire career, as I advise young people who want to join the Park Service, their entire career will be consumed by the impact of climate change. Your entire professional career. And that it is not enough to be technically good at your job. We need to work to train a new generation of environmental leaders skilled in science, skilled in politics, and principled by social justice and a passion to have it happen. That training is unlikely to happen. That training is unlikely to happen at status quo institutions like universities. It is unlikely to happen in established non-government organizations that are big and have lots to lose. But somewhere, somehow, a small professional society or a consortium of faculty or a mix of folk in and out of academe will decide to create a boot camp, a training program to train the best and brightest young people to take the lead in the future battles. A third is, as scientists, I think we need to redouble our efforts to communicate with clarity and honesty. It fascinates me working as a scientist / political guy in Washington to watch how many scientists come to talk to us and have two lost skills. One is the ability to separate what's important from not. The director taught me a great trick. I think I still have it. In my wallet is a small card. It has really small print. And when we're being briefed and I can see the director's eyes glaze over, or he takes out his phone and begins to do this while they're talking, I slip the card in front of the scientist who is excited to do the briefing. And the card simply says in small print, so they have to look at it, "Stop talking." We have to learn how to separate what's important and what's not, and we have to speak honestly, which means sharing uncertainty. Remember, to a policy decision maker, sharing your science without the level of certainty associated with that science means your science can't be helpful. They can't act. So you need to say, this is what we learned and this is how sure we are. They need both of those, and we need to become skilled in that so that the next generation of scientists, and during this long war and the rough waters of the next 4 years, the scientific community can communicate with clarity and honesty. Geographers, with their distinctive sense of place and advanced technical tools, have a special opportunity and responsibility, particularly to play an active role in all of those potential activities. You belong at the table trying to monitor the erosion that will occur, and you belong at the table trying to figure out how to train the next generation, and you need to speak the truth as you see it. Your theme, Geography 2050, is clearly an over-the-horizon future. Old ones like me will be gone. Young ones here who clapped will be old. Lerner Hall, if it's not been torn down, will likely be protected with pumps from the seawater first taking Manhattan. Environmental historians and grandchildren visiting national parks will ask us, what was it like during the stormy time, the time of rough water? How will we respond? What chart did we follow? What did we do to protect the American Covenant of National Parks when they were challenged? In this centennial year and the years to follow, we might, all of us, keep those questions in mind. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have time for questions?
We have a couple moments for maybe one or two questions.
Sure. I'll stand at the very edge. It gives a frisson of tension. You think, is that old guy going to drop, or is he going to answer the question? Please speak up. Yes, sir.
Thank you for that eloquent talk. I was once taught by someone in the State Department, it's good to talk to people in a language they understand. And this is one of the issues when scientists come to policymakers and so on. How would you suggest scientists now address a new administration that is more interested in different approaches to the world around us and maybe more transactional versus policy or what have you?
That's a good question. And while I'm tempted to provide a humorous answer, very small words and small sentences, I do believe a serious effort at choosing rhetoric that does not deny or corrode our own understandings. The critical first move in the erosion of and denial of climate change is when one of you decides to accommodate it and says, well, I'll just talk about global change, or I'll just talk about change, because they won't like the word climate change. That is corrosive to what you do and actually a denial to them. So there are some parts of the rhetoric that you have to keep because it's the truth as we best know it right now, right? I do think that this will be a period of time when economic arguments carry great freight. But economic arguments are not all about money. It's not all about money. It's about jobs. For example, national parks, it's not about how much money they create. It's that high school kids in a gateway community can stay and live in the community they're at and get a good job working to support the park. So I would not be seduced into the monetization of everything. But economics is more than that. It includes, for example, in the Park Service, I would expect this administration to erode all kinds of environmental protection, but be all in favor of construction. Are you surprised? Well, we have two options. One option is to fight that every step of the way, but we have a backlog of maintenance unfulfilled in the Park Service of over $400 billion. If we can use this administration to accomplish those things within principle and sound protection, then we get somewhere. That's why I say, for those who want to be accommodationists, there is a role for you. That's not bad, it's just a choice. But for each of us, there will be that moment when you scratch your head and say, can I really say that? And that's the moment of decision. Someone else?
One more
yes,
question.
Sir.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. That was excellent. I want to ask you specifically about the point you made about uncertainty and the importance of communicating uncertainty to the public in a way that resonates. I've thought for some time that there are problems when scientists use that word, uncertainty, because in science it has a relatively well-understood, rigorous meaning referring to the degree of confidence that we have in a result. But oftentimes, when the public hears that word uncertainty, what they take from that is scientists don't really know what's happening. And so I wonder if there's a way that we can better communicate this really critical idea, perhaps without using that word, or in a way that will better convey the reality, the scientific reality, without causing the kind of consternation that it might.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
Yes, there is. And we have experience doing that. Where's Craig? Craig Colton, I first met Craig when he joined our experimental scenario building group during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And we had to communicate science very quickly to decision makers with uncertainty. And what we did is we took the IPCC's fourth assessment policy summary and how they walked across scientific probabilities, which will glaze over the decision makers, into simple English. Was an effect probable? Was it likely? Was it certain? Do we not know? Is it unlikely? And by systematically using those words, systematically, and being transparent how you get there, the policymaker begins to understand the range of what you're talking about. Am I suggesting you tell a decision maker, I have a high level of significant uncertainty? No. But the responsibility to say, we think this is going to happen and we're sure, or we think this is going to happen. It's plausible, but not probable. They're not that dumb. They'll be able to figure it out if we walk it to plain English. Thank you. You've been very patient, and congratulations on your meeting here. And actually, you don't have to worry about Lerner Hall filling up for a little while.
Thank you, Gary.